Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you love powerful true stories from history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest episodes. Now, let's begin today's story. Asterisk the story begins in a quiet town in Poland before the war turned the world upside down. It was the kind of town that could have existed in almost any country, where neighbors greeted each other in the street, where fathers worked hard to provide, and where children played outside until the sun went down. Among the families who lived, there was a Jewish baker and his wife, raising their 3 children. The oldest was their daughter, a bright-eyed girl named Rivka, full of laughter and dreams, who loved nothing more than to help her father knead dough in the bakery, her hands covered in flour as she pretended to be a grown woman running the shop. Her younger brothers followed her everywhere, tugging on her sleeves, laughing when she made faces at them. Life was not easy. The family lived simply, with little money to spare, but there was warmth in their home. Rivka's mother kept everything tidy and filled the small house with the smell of soup simmering on the stove. Her father, though often tired from long hours of work, always found time to tell the children stories at night. They were stories of courage, of faith, of ancestors who had endured hardships and yet kept going. To Rivka, the world, though small, felt safe, but safety did not last. The shadow of war spread quickly across Europe. In September of 1939, when the German army invaded Poland, the streets of Rivka's town changed overnight. Soldiers in gray uniforms and black boots filled the marketplace, barking orders in a language the children didn't understand. At first, there was confusion more than fear. Then came the restrictions. Jewish shops were marked. Jewish families were forced to wear yellow stars on their clothing. Neighbors who once shared bread and laughter began to avoid eye contact. Some whispered insults. Some grew cold, afraid to be seen with their Jewish friends. The bakery was vandalized. A glass window smashed, the shelves overturned. Rivka's father tried to repair what he could, but the soldiers made it clear Jews could no longer run businesses. It was only the beginning. Soon, families were ordered to leave their homes and move into crowded ghettos. Rivka, her parents, and her brothers carried what little they could: blankets, a few pots, and her father's prayer book. The streets they had known were now close to them. They were herded into narrow, crumbling buildings behind barbed wire. Where hunger and sickness grew like weeds, life in the ghetto was a daily struggle. Too many people crammed into too little space. Food was scarce, rationed in scraps that could never fill a stomach. Rivka's mother grew thinner each week, saving what little she had for the children. Rivka's father, once proud and strong, lined up for hours each day hoping for work, hoping it might bring an extra loaf of bread. Rivka tried to keep her brothers distracted, inventing games, teaching them songs. But their faces grew hollow, their voices weaker. She had once believed the world was safe. Now she began to wonder if safety was only an illusion. Then came the roundups. Soldiers stormed the ghetto with dogs and rifles. Families were forced into the streets. Those who resisted were beaten. Those who stumbled were shot. Rivka clutched her youngest brother's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. Her father whispered hurried prayers as they were pushed toward the train station, her mother holding the other boy close to her chest. They were packed into cattle cars, wooden wagons meant for animals, not people. There was no space to sit, barely room to breathe. The stench of fear and waste filled the air. Hours stretched into days. No one knew where they were going. When the train doors finally opened, they were at Auschwitz. A sign at the entrance read, "Arbeit macht frei." Work sets you free. The words mocked the thousands who passed beneath them. Rivka had never smelled anything like the air there. It was thick, bitter, carrying the scent of something burning that clung to the skin. Guards shouted orders. Men were separated from women. Families were torn apart in seconds. Rivka was pushed one way, her mother another, her father dragged. Aside with the men. She screamed, reaching for her brothers, but the crowd swallowed them. That was the last she ever saw of her family. Inside Auschwitz, Rivka's world shattered completely. Her hair was shaved. Her clothes were taken. A number was tattooed onto her arm, replacing her name. She was no longer Rivka, the baker's daughter, the sister, the girl who loved songs and stories. She was just a number in a camp built to destroy human beings. Every day began with roll call in the freezing cold. Prisoners stood for hours as guards counted them, beating anyone who moved or collapsed. Then came work, endless labor, heavy loads, digging, carrying, cleaning, until every muscle ached. Food was a watery soup, a piece of bread so small it could vanish in 2 bites. Hunger gnawed constantly. Disease spread quickly in the crowded barracks. The sound of gunshots echoed across the camp. The smoke from the chimneys never stopped. But Rivka learned how to survive. She learned to keep her head down, to work without drawing attention. She learned which guards were the cruelest and how to stay out of their sight. She learned to hide her emotions, because tears could be dangerous. Yet somewhere deep inside, she held on to a spark of defiance. She remembered her father's stories. She remembered her mother's hands. She remembered her brother's laughter. And she promised herself that if she lived, she would not let their memory vanish. When the war turned against Germany and the Red Army began pushing closer, the camp grew even more brutal. The guards became desperate, forcing prisoners on death marches, trying to cover up the evidence of their crimes. Rivka barely survived those last months. But when liberation finally came, she was just 17 years old, skin and bone, scarred. In body and spirit, yet alive. Survival, however, was not the end. For Rivka, it was the beginning of something new, something fierce. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her childhood. But what remained was her will, harder than steel. She could not simply rebuild her life as if nothing had happened. She could not forgive. She could not forget. She carried the voices of the dead inside her, voices that cried out for justice. And she swore that she would answer them. That vow became her path. The war was over. The world was trying to move on, but Rivka was not ready to move on. She was ready to fight back. When the gates of Auschwitz opened and Soviet soldiers marched in, the survivors were not sure if they were dreaming. Many were too weak to walk, too broken in body and mind to understand what was happening. Rivka stood among them, thin as a shadow, her eyes sunken, her body trembling with fever. She could not believe she was alive. The soldiers gave out food and water, but even that was dangerous after so much starvation. Too much food could kill a starving body. She ate small pieces slowly, afraid her stomach would betray her. In those first days of freedom, the world felt strange. The prisoners who had clung to life inside the camp now faced another test: how to return to a world that had been destroyed. Many had no homes to go back to, no families waiting for them. They carried not just hunger and illness, but grief so heavy it was hard to breathe. Rivka looked at her tattooed arm, at the number that replaced her name, and felt both rage and Folda's rage and despair. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. She was placed in a displaced persons camp, one of the many makeshift shelters created across Europe for survivors who had nowhere to return to. There were cots lined up in rows, medical workers tending to the sick, volunteers trying to bring comfort with blankets and words of hope. But even in this safety, Rivka could not rest. She had nightmares every night: guards shouting, dogs barking, the smell of smoke, the cries of her brothers. She would wake drenched in sweat, her hands clenched into fists. The war was over, but the war lived inside her still. Many survivors tried to rebuild their lives quietly. Some searched desperately for relatives, posting names on walls, traveling from camp to camp hoping to find a familiar face. Rivka searched too, but there was no one left. Her parents, her brothers all gone. The silence of that truth nearly crushed her. She was 17, alone in the world, a child with no family, no home, no future that she could see. Yet she refused to give in. Something inside her whispered that to live was not enough. To live meant carrying memory, and to carry memory meant finding justice. Justice, however, was not easy in the chaos of post-war Europe. Many Nazis had fled, disappearing into the ruins of Germany or slipping into new identities. Some were captured and tried in the great courtrooms of Nuremberg, where the world first heard the full scale of the crimes. But countless others escaped notice, living quietly, blending back into villages, pretending they had been ordinary soldiers or simple farmers. For Rivka, this was unbearable. She had seen their faces. She had heard their orders. She had watched them kill without mercy. How could they now walk free, as if nothing had happened? In those early months, whispers spread among survivors about revenge. Some believed only God could judge. Some believed rebuilding Jewish life was the answer. But there were others, young, furious, broken yet burning, who spoke of hunting down the guilty. Rivka listened, and her heart stirred. She had no weapons, no power, but she had her memory. She remembered names, uniforms, faces. She remembered which guards laughed while striking prisoners, which officers gave orders, which men stood near the gas chambers. She carried those names like stones in her pocket, heavy and impossible to forget. She began to write them down. In a small notebook given to her by a relief worker, she scribbled what she could recall, descriptions, voices, moments. It was her record, her proof, her vow. Others around her did the same. Survivors whispered about forming groups, about finding the ones responsible. Some even dreamed of great plans to poison the water supplies of German cities, to wipe out those who had been complicit. Not all such plans succeeded, but the will to strike back was real, and Rivka felt herself drawn into it. Her first act of defiance came not in violence, but in testimony. Officials began asking survivors for their stories. At first, Rivka was afraid. The memories were raw, the pain unbearable. But when she saw others speaking, when she saw the disbelief in the faces of listeners, she knew she had to lend her voice. She told them about the trains, the selections, the roll calls, the hunger, the deaths. She told them about her family. Her words were broken, her voice trembling, but each word was a piece of truth placed into the world. And as she spoke, she realized this too was a kind of revenge. To speak the truth in the face of those who tried to erase it. Yet speaking was not enough for Rivka. She wanted more. She wanted to see the guilty face judgment. She wanted to know that the world would not simply forgive and move on. In the following years, as trials spread across Europe, she traveled to testify. She stood in courtrooms where former guards once feared, now sat in chains. She pointed to them and said, "I remember you." Her words struck like arrows. Some denied, some wept, some remained cold. But Rivka did not falter. She had survived their cruelty, and now it was her turn to confront them. Every time she spoke, she felt her voice grow stronger. The girl who had once been silenced in Auschwitz was no longer silent. She spoke not only for herself, but for the millions who could not speak. Each testimony was a wound reopened, but also a small victory. The world was forced to listen. Newspapers wrote down her words. Judges recorded her testimony. History began to take shape, brick by brick, through the voices of survivors like her. Still, Rivka's heart carried more than a desire for justice. It carried rage. She could not rest knowing so many had escaped. She began to work quietly with groups who searched for Nazis in hiding. Sometimes this meant gathering information. Sometimes it meant pointing out a man in a village square, whispering. To others, that is him. Sometimes it meant confronting collaborators who had betrayed their Jewish neighbors. Rivka, still so young, became a hunter of memory. She had no gun, no army, but her courage was weapon enough. The years after the war were not kind. Survivors faced suspicion, poverty, displacement. Many countries did not want them. In America, immigration quotas limited the number who could enter. Some were resettled in Israel, where the dream of a Jewish homeland offered a new beginning. Rivka herself was torn. She longed for a place to call home, but she could not shake the feeling that her true home was among the memories of the dead. Wherever she went, Auschwitz went with her dot, and so she lived with a double burden. The need to rebuild and the need to remember. She learned languages, worked jobs, tried to create a future. But in the quiet hours, the faces of her family returned. In the stillness of night, she heard her brother's laughter, her mother's voice, her father's prayers. She carried them with her into every courtroom, every testimony, every act of defiance. She was not only Rivka anymore. She was the voice of a people nearly destroyed, a living witness who refused to let silence cover the truth. This was her revenge. Not the blind fury of blood for blood, but the steady fire of truth and justice. To live when she was meant to die. To speak when she was meant to be silenced. To name the guilty when they hoped to be forgotten. Rivka, the young girl who walked out of Auschwitz, had become a force the Nazis had not counted on a survivor who would fight back, not with weapons, but with memory, courage, and the will to keep the world from forgetting. The years passed, yet for Rivka time never truly moved forward. Each day carried with it the weight of what she had seen. And though the world outside rebuilt itself with new buildings and new governments, inside her heart the ruins of Auschwitz remained. Still, she forced herself to move through life. She found work, first in menial jobs that required no skill, just hands willing to scrub or carry. Later she learned trades, languages, and began piecing together something that resembled stability. But it was never easy. In the years just after the war, the world was eager to look forward, not back. Many people wanted to forget. Towns tried to bury their shame. Countries wanted to rebuild their pride. Rivka saw this with growing anger. She had lived through hell. She had watched her family torn away, and now she was told, silently but firmly, to move on. To be grateful for survival. But gratitude was not what she felt. What she felt was an open wound that never closed. What gave her strength was the knowledge that she was not alone. Other survivors shared her fury, her grief, her need to remember. In the displaced persons camps and in the refugee communities of Europe, they found each other, whispering their stories in dark corners, telling each other, "We must speak. We must make them hear." For Rivka, those gatherings were a lifeline. They were proof that though the Nazis had destroyed so much, they had not destroyed everything. Eventually, she emigrated. Like so many survivors, she dreamed of America, the land across the ocean where freedom seemed possible. It took time-long waits, interviews, papers, but at last she boarded a ship, carrying little more than a suitcase and her memories. The journey itself felt surreal. The sea stretched endlessly, and she wondered if she was leaving behind Europe, not just physically, but spiritually, carrying her ghosts across the waves into a new world. When she arrived, America did not welcome her with parades or kindness. Immigrants faced suspicion. Survivors were seen as outsiders. Her accent marked her. Her past set her apart. She took whatever work she could find, often labor that paid too little and demanded too much. But she endured, as she had endured before. America was not easy, but at least she was free. At least she could walk the streets without fear of soldiers. Breaking down her door got yet, even in freedom, the memories followed her. She could not escape the image of her mother's face, the last time she saw her, the sound of her brothers crying, the hollow eyes of her father. Night after night, she dreamed of trains, of smoke, of endless roll calls. She woke gasping, her hands clutching her chest. At first, she kept her story to herself. Few wanted to hear. When she mentioned Auschwitz, people shifted uncomfortably. Some doubted. Some dismissed. The silence was almost as painful as the camp itself, but Rivka refused to be silenced. Slowly, she began to speak. At first, it was to small groups, community gatherings, church basements, classrooms. She told the truth of what she had lived. Through, even when her voice shook. She described the trains, the barracks, the hunger, the cruelty. She described her family, not as faceless victims, but as people with names, with lives, with love. She made the dead live again through her words. And in doing so, she discovered something powerful. Her story was not just her own. It belonged to history, to the world, to the future. As the years went on, her role grew. She was called to testify. In trials across Europe, and later in America, where suspected war criminals were found living quietly in suburbs, pretending to be ordinary men, Rivka traveled, stood in courtrooms, and looked them in the eye. These men, who once commanded fear with their uniforms and guns, now shrank under the weight of her words. She pointed at them, her voice clear. "I remember you." It was a small phrase, but it carried the power of truth, and the power of truth was greater than any weapon. Her testimony was not without cost. Each time she spoke, she relived the terror. Each time, she opened wounds that had never healed. But she did it willingly, because she knew silence was what her enemies wanted. They wanted the world to forget. They wanted the memory of the camps to fade, and Rivka swore she would not allow that. To speak was to fight. To tell the truth was to take revenge. In time, she was invited to universities, to schools, to gatherings of veterans. In America, her story struck a deep chord, especially among older listeners who had lived through the war years themselves, but had never seen its darkest truths. She spoke slowly, with simple words, but each word carried a weight that drew her audience into silence. Many wept openly. Some asked her how she survived. She would answer with honesty, "I survived because I had no choice. I survived to tell you, and now you must carry it with me." Her words became a mission, not just a memory. She joined with other survivors to form organizations dedicated to preserving testimony. They recorded their voices, their stories, their faces, so that long after they were gone, the truth would remain. She became part of a movement that believed revenge was not only in trials, but in remembrance. To build museums, to write books, to teach children this too was vengeance against the ones who had tried to erase her people. Yet Rivka never forgot the other kind of revenge, the more direct kind. She stayed in touch with networks of Nazi hunters, men and women, who tracked fugitives across the world. When she heard of a name, she gave what information she could. Sometimes it was a memory of a face, sometimes a description of a uniform, sometimes a whispered detail she had once overheard in the camp. Every piece of information mattered. And when arrests were made, when guilty men were dragged before courts, Rivka felt a fierce satisfaction. It did not bring her family back, but it brought the world one step closer to justice. As her life moved forward, she found love, though it was not easy. She married another survivor, a man who carried his own scars, his own nightmares. Together they built a life, raising children who grew up in the shadow of their parents' memories. Rivka was determined that her children would know joy, but she also made sure they knew the truth. She told them of their grandparents, their uncles, their lost family. She showed them the number on her arm, the ink faded but still clear. She told them, "This is why I fight. This is why I speak." For Rivka, motherhood was both healing and painful. Each time she held her child, she remembered the brothers she had lost. Each time she set food on the table, she remembered the hunger of Auschwitz. Every smile of her children was a triumph over the darkness, yet also a reminder of what had been stolen. But she chose to live in that tension, to let it fuel her, to make her life a testament to survival. Her name began to be known, not just among survivors, but among historians, journalists, and ordinary Americans who heard her speak. She became one of the countless but powerful voices who shaped the world's understanding of the Holocaust. Through her, older Americans who had lived through rationing, through the war years, through the news of D-Day and VE Day, were confronted with the human side of the story they had only glimpsed in headlines. She made history personal. She made it impossible to ignore. In the quiet moments, Rivka would sit by the window and think of her family. She would picture her mother's face, her father's hands dusted with flour, her brothers chasing each other down a cobblestone street. She knew she would never stop missing them. But she also knew she had kept her vow. She had survived. She had fought back. She had spoken the truth. And in doing so, she had kept their memory alive in a world that had once tried to erase it. This was her life's work, her revenge, her legacy. Not just survival, but the power to make sure the world remembered. As the decades passed, the world changed, but for Rivka the past never faded. The tattoo on her arm remained, a small patch of ink that spoke louder than words. Every time she looked at it, she remembered the promise she had made to herself when she walked out of Auschwitz, that she would not stay silent, that she would not let her family's memory vanish, that she would fight back in the only way she could, by carrying truth into the future. In America, life grew steadier. Her children grew into adults, starting families of their own. Rivka saw her grandchildren play in yards, laugh in classrooms, and grow up with the freedom she had once dreamed of but never known. Each child was a victory. Each birthday, each graduation, each wedding was proof that the Nazis had failed. They had tried to wipe out a people, and yet here was Rivka's family, thriving on American soil, their voices carrying forward. She often said that her greatest revenge was not only in the courts or the testimonies, but in life itself, life lived fully, proudly, defiantly, in the face of death. But Rivka never allowed herself to rest entirely in that comfort. She knew memory was fragile. She saw how easily the world could turn away, how quickly new generations could forget what had happened. In the 1960s and 70s, when trials of Nazi war criminals began again, she traveled to Europe to testify once more. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a strong woman, a mother, a witness who knew the weight of her words. She stood in packed courtrooms, reporters scribbling notes, cameras flashing, and she pointed at men who had thought their crimes would be buried in time. "I remember you," she said again and again. Those 3 words cut through years of silence, carrying the weight of millions who could no longer speak. Her story reached wider audiences. She began to be invited to American schools and universities more often, speaking to students who had only read about the Holocaust in textbooks. She told them what starvation felt like, what it meant to be separated from family in a single instant, what it meant to see smoke in the sky and know what it carried. Her words were simple, but her voice carried such raw honesty that classrooms fell silent. teenagers holding back tears, teachers wiping their eyes. She told them, "I survived so I could tell you. You must never let the world forget." She was asked sometimes why she continued, why she did not simply move on and live her life in peace. Her answer never changed, because peace without memory is not peace. It is forgetting. And forgetting is the greatest danger of all. For Rivka, telling her story was not just an obligation, it was her weapon. It was her way of ensuring that the men who had destroyed her childhood could never truly erase her people. Every word she spoke was a stone placed against the tide of forgetting. As she grew older, Rivka also became part of larger projects of remembrance. She worked with museums, with archives, with organizations collecting survivor testimony. She sat in front of cameras, telling her story slowly, carefully, so that future generations could hear her even after she was gone. She donated her notebook, the one she had filled in those early days after liberation, with names, faces, fragments of memory, to a historical center where scholars could study it. It was her evidence, her gift, her revenge written on paper. In her later years, Rivka became something more than a survivor. She became a teacher, not in the formal sense, but in the way her presence carried lessons that no book could give. Her neighbors knew her as a kind but firm woman, one who carried both sorrow and strength in her eyes. Children in her community grew up hearing her story, sometimes on summer evenings when she sat outside, her voice steady, her memories unfolding. She was a living reminder of history, a bridge between past and present. She also became a voice in America's own reckoning with memory. In the 1980s, when Holocaust denial began to creep into public discourse, Rivka did not stay silent. She stood up, went to meetings, wrote letters, appeared at events, and spoke with the same sharp clarity she always had. "I was there," she said. "Do not tell me it did not happen. I carry it on my skin, in my heart, in my soul. You cannot erase it." Her testimony was more powerful than any argument. To look at her was to see truth written in flesh and blood. Even as her health began to decline in her later years, Rivka continued to speak whenever she could. Sometimes her children urged her to rest, to let others carry the burden. But she shook her head. "When I am gone, I will rest. Until then, I must speak." Her last public talks were given in schools, her voice weaker but still fierce. Students crowded around her afterward, holding her hands, thanking her through tears. She would smile at them and say, "Now it is your turn. You must tell others." And when she finally passed, in her 80s, her funeral was filled with people who had been touched by her life. Survivors, children, grandchildren, historians, teachers, neighbors all came to honor the girl who had once walked out of Auschwitz and vowed never to be silent. Her children spoke of her strength, her students spoke of her courage, and her community spoke of her kindness. She was remembered not only as a victim of history, but as a fighter who turned survival into a weapon, who turned memory into revenge, who carried the voices of the dead into the future. Rivka's story, like so many others, is not just about suffering. It is about resilience. It is about the will to live, the will to fight back, the will to turn horror into testimony. It is about a young girl who lost everything, yet found within herself the strength to stand up again and again and say, "I remember, and I will not let you forget." Her revenge was never carried out with bullets or bombs. It was carried out with words, with courage, with the simple act of living fully when she was meant to die. It was in her testimony, in the trials she helped shape, in the students she taught, in the children and grandchildren who carried her name forward. It was in the museums, the archives, the recordings that preserve her voice forever. The Nazis had sought to erase her people, to erase her family, to erase her life. But Rivka lived. She loved. She spoke. And through her, the world remembers. That is her victory. That is her revenge.